Well, hello guys. Let me just fix this here. But today we're going to be talking about a video by this guy named Professor Sticks. Let's see. Here it is. This guy, apparently. I don't know. I have no idea how this guy got popular at all. But somehow this guy has like 200,000 views, and it's just like him giving his opinion. But anyway, he has some questions for theistic evolutionists, and I'm not refuting here theistic evolution or that theistic evolution is a thing, but I am a theistic evolutionist in a sense, I suppose, in the sense that I accept evolution, and I think that God was involved. So I'm going to respond to some of his questions here, and yeah, hopefully it'll be interesting. Let's just go ahead and start, I suppose.
Which is why I didn't upload for like 10 days. I'm back now though, so we're going to jump straight into it. So apparently there's this term that is sometimes thrown around called theistic evolution. You may or may not have heard of it, but you've definitely heard of the concept behind it. Basically, it's the ideology that evolution is true, but it's not 100% natural, but rather behind the scenes, God is actually responsible for guiding it and or inventing its process. I haven't really given my thoughts on this before, I don't think, so I decided to make this quick video.
What do you say is theistic evolution? How would you describe theistic evolution, and do you think it is biblically compatible with the account in Genesis?
I guess I would say that theistic evolution would be the view that God creates biological complexity on this planet through the mechanisms and processes that are described in standard evolutionary biology. Mm-hmm. So that God is ultimately behind it, but that science gives an accurate description of the series of secondary causes.
By no means am I saying that people who believe in theistic evolution to be bad as creationists, because they at least believe in science behind it all. But do you see how this is essentially moving the goalpost? Nowhere in history would anyone believe that God created life on Earth today through a means of evolution in the time span of 3.5 billion years. That would just be completely unthinkable. But now that modern science has come out and provided evidence for evolution by natural selection, this religion now warps to, oh, of course it's true, but God was behind it all.
Okay, I mean, this is so weird. I mean, yeah, so of course nobody was thinking about evolution, before it was invented. But that's also true of atheists as well. I mean, there were no atheists out there saying, oh, well, humans evolved from apes, and, it took 3.5 billion years. The Earth is that old. Generally, what atheists held to prior to recently was that the universe was eternal. And so, are we going to say, oh, well, now that they accept that there, was a Big Bang, right? And that the universe kind of developed out of the Big Bang, even if you think something's prior to that, right? That's not what they thought. They literally thought that the Earth, just always existed, right? This was a very common view. So are we going to say that, oh, well, atheists are shifting the goalpost by saying that the Big Bang is, of course, it's true, and incorporating that into their belief system? No, that's not shifting the goalposts. That's simply adapting to the evidence. And neither is, atheist accepting evolution shifting the goalpost. It's just accepting the evidence. And there's also this view that somehow prior to, evolution, Darwin, everybody was just on the same page with respect to what Genesis meant. And then all of a sudden, they just all reinterpreted it to accept evolution. That's not even close to true. Generally speaking, people had various different views on the interpretation of Genesis, including, for example, St. Augustine thought that the days in Genesis referred to something analogous to angels, I think is what it was. Origen said that it was obvious that it wasn't meant to be taken literally because the plants were created before the sun, right? And the sunlight is necessary for the life of plants. So there were multiple interpretations, and it was generally held to be just kind of a matter of opinion rather than a matter of faith with respect to the interpretation of Genesis. So it isn't even as if, well, Christians had this sort of young earth creationist view for thousands of years and then just Darwin came by and they switched. That's not actually true. Young earth creationism as a movement really, I mean, there were young earth creationists in the past, of course, but as a movement, it really began like in the early 20th century. So, and I think he says more, so let's continue.
What this means is that no matter what we present, no matter what we discover, there's no way to disprove God. As a result, this version of God is unfalsifiable, which makes it a bad positive claim. Funny, I just did a video on this and now we're talking about it again. But yeah,
well, that's not even close to true. I mean, just because you adapt your view to the evidence doesn't mean that your view is unfalsifiable. Like I said, just because atheists have changed their view from the view that the earth just always existed to the view that the entire universe evolved and, you know, in a sense from a singular point from the Big Bang, that doesn't mean that atheism is unfalsifiable. And just to, you know, give an example, say if you want to show that theism is false, then what you would do is you would simply show a contradiction inside of his nature. So for example, people try to do this by showing a contradiction between God's omniscience and his omnibenevolence, or the freedom of creatures, you know, the fact that some people will say that because God knows the future, we cannot be free. That's one argument people make. I don't agree with it, but there's different ways of approaching falsifying God. Just because one of the ways failed doesn't mean that God's unfalsifiable, right? Even if all of the ways of falsifying God fails, that doesn't mean God is unfalsifiable. It just means that in fact God was not falsified. Finally, I would also mention that this idea of falsifiability as a necessary precondition for like valid beliefs is completely ridiculous. Sure, whenever it comes to science, say, it makes sense for us to have beliefs that are falsifiable, because when we're talking about science, we're talking about beliefs that are testable. And so we would want testable beliefs to be falsifiable. But Karl Popper, the guy who invented falsificationism, he didn't ever apply this view beyond the scientific method. It was never meant to incorporate all knowledge, and especially when we're talking about metaphysical knowledge. And that's important because when we're talking about God, we're talking about metaphysical knowledge. And furthermore, to give you an example, the law of non-contradiction, for example, that position, the principle, is completely unfalsifiable. You can't falsify the law of non-contradiction. That is, that being is not non-being. Because if you falsify it, then it's true. In other words, if it's false that non-being, or if it's false that the law of non-contradiction is true, then it's going to be true and false at the same time, right? Because that's basically what the law of non-contradiction says. says that a true statement cannot be simultaneously false in the same way, in the same respect, right? So if you're saying that it's false, that a true statement cannot be false in the same way, in the same respect, then it's going to follow that the law of non-contradiction is both true and false at the same time. Because you're saying that it's going to be true and false at the same time. So it's absolutely unfalsifiable, right? And that's going to be true with all laws of logic, right? Because they're the basis of our knowledge. They're not something that you test. It's something that's a prerequisite for testing. So, in that case, I'm going to say that, yeah, the falsifiability principle is simply something you can't apply universally. And so it doesn't even matter if it doesn't apply to God. Although I would say that there are ways that you could falsify God if God were false.
Moving the goalpost of a claim such as religion makes it unworthy, because by that logic, nothing would be able to disprove your version of God. That being said, again, I think people who believe in theistic evolution or old earth creationism aren't as bad as young earth creationists, because they at least acknowledge the scientific evidence behind evolution by natural selection and all of natural history.
Now, I don't think theistic evolution excludes that God might intervene at particular points in the process to do something miraculously.
Yeah, that part has always been left to a good degree of ambiguity, but for those of you who think he intervened, where did he intervene? Please tell me when and where he intervened and why he intervened. Especially that why part is pretty confusing to me. Unless it involved humans directly, why would he intervene in the evolution of, say, other animals or insects? And if he did have to intervene, why go through the trouble of creating the process of natural selection to begin with? If it's not going to exactly produce the result you want so that you have to go back and hand edit it on your own, why not just create everything as you want to begin with? Seems like...
Alright, well, so there's many different ways I could approach this. First of all, my view of God is such that he necessarily sustains everything in existence at every moment in time. I don't think things exist in virtue of themselves independently of God. And that's because, there's several arguments for this. For example, the argument for motion. If the argument for motion is true, then creatures can't even move or change, right? Without God sustaining that process, without God providing the ultimate actuality, which is actualizing the potentiality involved in that process. And I have several videos on that, so I won't go into too much depth into the argument for motion. But if you have this view where things can't even change or be actual in the first place without God causing it, then of course that's going to be a sense of theistic evolution, because God is ultimately underneath in a sort of metaphysical way. He's fundamentally behind all of the changes, not only evolution, but just, creatures walking around and such, right? Another thing to consider is that when it comes to evolution, what we're having is ultimately we have sort of higher states of being coming from lower states of being. So there's obviously a sense in which just chemicals and molecules and such are lower than, say, a single-celled organism. And that single-celled organisms are lower than human beings or even plants or other animals. And they contain sort of less actuality. And so there's a real problem with this idea that higher states of actuality come from lower states of actuality. That's due to the principle of proportionate causality. It seems that in order for something to become actual, right, it has to have that actuality pre-exist in the cause, and that actuality from the cause has to be imparted into the effect. And it seems like a real problem to say that these lower states of animals and molecules and such produce the higher when they don't have that actuality in them. And so, of course, the question becomes, where does that actuality come from? And if you don't include any sort of higher cause, which contains that actuality within it, it seems like your answer is going to be from nothing. Now, of course, some people will argue that it's not actually a higher state of actuality and that it's actually all reducible to individual atoms, but we're going to argue against that because we believe, as Thomists, we believe in wholes, we believe in forms, we believe that human beings are not just reducible, for example, to their molecular structure, right? Even the structure is going to be something greater than just the parts because it's going to be a whole. So that's going to be another issue. The actuality, where does that come from in evolution? So there's multiple ways of considering this. One way is just to say that God infused that actuality somehow in the plan of the whole, and that somehow manifest through through his plan, through natural causes. Another way to think about it would be to say that, well, whenever a whole new substance came to be, that was not, although the certain accidental causes had to be involved in order to, say, put the molecules in, say, the right order, right? To actually form a whole substance, that would require an act of God. Substance is going to be first of all, because, like I said, the whole is going to be greater than the parts, and so the parts don't have sufficient causality to cause the whole. But also, the substance is the most basic level of the reality of a being. And so if we're going to be talking about things coming from nothing, right, which is essentially what one substance coming to be involves, that would require an act of God in actualizing that substance at sort of like a metaphysical level, right? And that, of course, wouldn't exclude evolution per se. It would just exclude a sort of naturalism with respect to evolution. Thirdly, there's one more, like with you said not with respect to humans, but it is important to point out with respect to humans, there's also the key point that what we are composed of is body and soul. And the soul is, for a human being, is going to be immaterial because the intellect has the capacity to grasp abstracts, which are not material but universal. So whenever it comes to the soul in human beings, the intellective soul, that is going to be immaterial, which means that it can't really come about by a material process. So we can't have material, for the same reason as before when we were talking about the higher coming from the lower. Material processes don't have the actuality prerequisite for causing immaterial things. They can only cause material things. There's no immateriality by which the material things could cause the immaterial. So that material soul would have to be infused directly by God as well. So those are three cases I can think of where we could argue that God would be necessary. First of all, at the metaphysical level. Secondly, when we have jumps from lower to higher organisms. And thirdly, whenever it comes to the intellectual nature or soul of the human being being infused inside of human beings.
Like a pretty roundabout way of creating life on Earth for no good reason. On the flip side, if you believe God didn't intervene, then what's the point of claiming God was behind it to begin with? If you believe that an external divine force is not required for evolution, then why believe at all that a supernatural being was guiding the process when there's no evidence on that side whatsoever? Why not?
Okay, so he also mentioned, so why would God do it this way? Well, God likes to... There's a kind of beauty to having creatures act on their own as much as possible. And so this is the same reason why God would give us the capacity to pray for others, for example, right? Because God wants us to be active. He wants us to be a part of the good. And that's part of sharing the goodness with us. And so, part of sharing his goodness with creatures is allowing them to develop. And even if you don't believe in evolution, right? Animals have this power of creation, participates inside the power of creation of God by having children, for example, right? So, why didn't God just create each animal from nothing every time a new animal came into existence? Why have them give birth, right? So it's not even this question or problem is not even specific to evolution. You could do it with anything. Why does God want us to farm instead of just giving us all the food that we need, right? It's really it's the same kind of question. It's not, and I think that it's very kind of shallow. It makes sense to me that God would want to have his creation actually doing something. That's what he created it for, right? And like I said, I think there's a kind of beauty to creation actually developing itself and having this sort of power to be involved in creation. And I think that that's not, a beautiful thing. And it's also much more interesting than if God just poofed everything into existence.
Just believe whatever we have evidence for. You already went so far as to believe in evolution, something that has been proven to without a shadow of a doubt, so why don't you take that extra step and think fully scientifically? Oh, and
it's not unscientific to include philosophy and metaphysics in your thinking. You can be perfectly scientific and also include metaphysics and philosophy. In fact, science requires metaphysics and philosophy as a basis for it to even exist. If you don't believe me, then just ask yourself this question: how do you know that science is a good method for discovering reality? And you're going to have to ultimately rely on something outside of science to prove that. Because if you use science to prove that science is a good method for discovering reality, then that'll be circular reasoning. You'll be using science to prove science. So ultimately, you need something beyond science as a basis for science. And that basis is, in fact, philosophy. In fact, natural science or natural philosophy was the prerequisite name for science. And, scientists were called natural philosophers because science actually developed out of philosophy, just historically speaking. So you can't really reduce all knowledge to science. You have to include outside philosophy. And it's perfectly legitimate to include God in your explanation for evolution on a metaphysical level, and that's still thinking fully scientifically. It's just not applying science where it ought not be applied, because science does not apply to everything.
For those of you who don't know if God intervened or not, that doesn't help at all either. The reason I ask those questions to begin with is because I'm trying to dig further in what you believe or your positive claim. Because if you leave it ambiguous as it is now, it will again become unfalsifiable. Claims need to be specific. So if you haven't thought about it before, I encourage you to do so.
But basically, it would accept the explanatory mechanisms that are postulated by contemporary evolutionary biology.
The result may be the same, but the process of getting there is just as important. What is science if you don't think scientifically? If you don't accept the scientific method, which is the bread and butter of everything we know in science? I'd rather have someone be a strict follower of the scientific method and not believe certain scientific findings than vice versa. It's kind of the same concept of giving a man a fish versus teaching him how to fish.
And I think that once you give up the view that Genesis 1 teaches that the world was created in 6 consecutive 24-hour days, that it's striking that it does not say anything about how God created the plants and animals.
I mean, that's kind of the thing, right? The Bible is exceptionally vague, and even if you disprove anything in Genesis, it's incredibly easy to twist the words in the Bible or read it metaphorically so that it's no longer disproven. Again, moving the goalpost and becoming unfalsifiable.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's not true. Just because you can reinterpret something in a different way doesn't mean that it's unfalsifiable. It just means that there's multiple ways to interpret it. And, you know, this has been understood for thousands of years. Like I said, I've addressed this, so I'll continue.
But if it's truly meant to be interpreted differently, then I see no good reason for God to mask his words in ambiguity. Everything would be significantly easier for humans and for God if he was just more specific on how the world was created in the story of Genesis.
Okay, but you're just assuming that that's God's goal, right? I hear this all the time from atheists, but it's like, how do you know that God's goal is to be clear to everybody? Jesus said that he spoke in parables specifically so that some people would not understand and would not be saved. So ambiguity is, if you understand Christianity, is clearly a part of it. And, you know, there's multiple reasons for that. One is so that to keep non-believers, whenever we're talking about obstinate non-believers who do not actually want to see, where they don't deserve to know that knowledge, basically. And if they did have that knowledge, all that they would do is just use it against you anyway. So hiding it from them is of great benefit, actually. Another thing to consider is that because of this ambiguity, many different things have been able to develop, such as experts on the topic, you know, various interpretations. It provides an opportunity for people to develop intellectually, to provide novel interpretations, to just think through the faith, and also for the church, as I am a Catholic, right, to provide their own authoritative interpretations, which of course they haven't in this case, but whenever we're talking about the Bible in general, it provides that opportunity for the church to step in. And so what I'm saying is there are multiple good things that can come out of making the Bible ambiguous. And those good things could be God's goal. There's no reason to believe that God's goal was to make the Bible 100% clear for everybody so that everybody could easily understand it. Maybe God's goal was to provide a text which could be interpreted by experts and provide a career for experts so that they could develop their intellectual capacities and so forth. So I just think that this is a very narrow-minded, like, it's like they're putting themselves in the position of God and say, well, if I were God, I would do this. And it's like, okay, but you're not God. God could have many different motivations and different goals than you do. So stop putting yourself in the place of God.
I mean, come on, people are even claiming the word day is not even a 24-hour day anymore. That is some serious goalpost moving.
Okay, again, this has been a thing for thousands of years. Read what St. Augustine said. St. Augustine did not hold that the days were 24-hour days. Origen didn't hold this. There's many people who never held this. So you just clearly haven't looked into this.
In fact, when God creates the plants on the third day, it's very striking. God doesn't say, let there be vegetation and fruit trees on the earth, and
true.
it was so. What it says is, let the earth bring forth vegetation and fruit trees bearing fruit after the kind. And it was so. The earth brought forth these things. And similarly for the animals, the earth brought them forth.
I don't believe you, so I'm gonna look it up. Oh, he's right. Okay, so please tell me, what exactly does this mean? The first life form on Earth wasn't even an animal or plant. It wasn't even a eukaryote. It was a single-celled prokaryotic organism. So this would conflict with the origin of life, no? Animals and plants didn't arise to begin with, no matter if it came from him or the Earth. So what exactly does God mean here? If the Earth brought about them, is he talking about a time frame of 3 billion years of evolution? But even so, plants and animals didn't even come from the Earth, so how do you even define Earth here? Does the word Earth include all chemicals found on the surface of this planet, such as water, hydrogen, lipids, sunlight, etc.? Because that's kind of a stretch, isn't it? If not, then life didn't come from, quote, the Earth. Pointing out.
All right, I mean, this is way over analyzing things. I mean, first of all, the Earth could mean multiple things, but beyond that, I mean, let's say that by the Earth it just meant like the dirt, right? Okay, so what happened according to like the naturalist explanation? Okay, according to the naturalist explanation, right? Chemicals came together, form a single-celled organism, or maybe something prior to that. That single-celled organism then evolved into multicellular organisms, and ultimately, resulting in human beings. Okay, that's still developing from the Earth. The ultimate origin for all life is going to be the Earth, if we're talking about it in terms of like the dirt or the chemicals. So yeah, there's nothing inconsistent about this at all. And of course, like, I'm not saying this is the right way to interpret it. It's plausible, but I'm just saying he's way over analyzing this and being way too skeptical about it.
Out that Genesis says Earth doesn't really help here, does it? Because at the end of the day, it's just as ambiguous as if hypothetically it's said that plants and animals came from God's creation directly.
I mean, not quite, because the fact that it says that it comes from the Earth, and that's consistent with the sort of evolutionary account, that's significant. It's a lot more, because, I mean, it's not that, of course, God directly creating creatures is inconsistent with that, because God is directly creating all creatures at all moments of time. So that's not inconsistent, but it's clearly more indicative of a natural process, or it's closer to evolution to say that the Earth brought forth the animals, right? That's a way that you could actually describe evolution, the evolutionary account. So I don't think that you can act like this is somehow not consistent, or anyway.
So I think there's already an intimation there by the author that God's creation of these plants and animals is fully compatible with identifying natural secondary causes that are involved in their development and origin.
I don't understand William Lane Craig here. Are you a young earth creationist or a, I guess, theistic evolutionist? If you believe in evolution like it sounds like you do in this video, then please tell your other buddies, Kent Hovind, Eric Hovind, David Reeves, all the famous creationists, on why they're wrong. It almost always feels like it's an atheism vs creationist debate, when young earth and old earth creationists are just as conflicting with each other. Anyway, thanks for sticking.
I don't know if this is really a valid criticism. I mean, there are multiple evolutionists who are also theists who have been involved in the debate. I can't remember his name, but there was one guy who was the head of the Genome Project who wrote stuff on this, I believe. The Human Genome Project. But anyway, as for myself, I've definitely spoken to creationists about whether evolution is true before. It's not something that I focus on, though, because I'm more interested in the atheism versus theism debate. And I think whenever it comes to William Lane Craig, that's obviously his focus as well, because he's the Kalam guy. He's the guy who's known for presenting the Kalam cosmological argument. He's not a biologist, and that's just not his focus. So, yeah. But anyway, I think that's all that he has to say on this topic. It was a pretty short video. This video was actually a request by one of my followers. If you guys want to request a video for me to respond to, I would appreciate that. It would be, I'd love being able to respond to things that people want to see responses to. And I don't necessarily keep up with all of the YouTube atheists out there. So if you guys saw a video you'd like to see a response to, no 7-hour Joe Schmidt videos. I'm not doing 7 hours Joe Schmidt rebuttals. I just don't have time for that kind of thing. But yeah, if you have a video request, please send it to me.